Marcus James stepped into his own restaurant, but no one knew who he was. Dressed in a simple button-down and slacks, he looked like any other customer, and that's exactly what he wanted. The elegant atmosphere buzzed with quiet conversations, the clinking of silverware, and the soft hum of background music. He had built this place from the ground up, ensuring it was a welcoming space for all. But today, he was here to see if his employees were actually living up to that vision. He walked up to the hostess stand where a waitress, Lisa, barely glanced at him. "Table for one?" he asked. Lisa sighed, clearly bored and unimpressed. She handed him a menu without even looking at him. "Yeah, sure, over there." She pointed toward a table near the kitchen, the worst seat in the house. Marcus raised an eyebrow but said nothing. He took his seat and scanned the room. Other diners, mostly white, were being led to better tables, receiving warm welcomes, and given friendly smiles. A waiter rushed over to a couple nearby, enthusiastically asking about their day. But Marcus? He sat ignored for nearly 10 minutes. Finally, Lisa strolled over, arms crossed. "What do you want to order?" Marcus glanced around. "Can I get a glass of water first?" Lisa rolled her eyes. "Before I take your order, you need to pay up front." Marcus's expression didn't change. He set the menu down, leaning back slightly. "Excuse me?" Lisa smirked. "That's our policy." Marcus looked around again. Not a single other table had paid up front. The elegant white couple beside him had just ordered wine without even pulling out their wallets. He turned back to Lisa. "It's your policy, or just your policy for me." Lisa's smirk faded slightly. She shifted uncomfortably but stood her ground. "Sir, if you can't afford to eat here, maybe you should try somewhere else." Marcus felt the heat rise in his chest, but he stayed calm. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his wallet, and placed his credit card on the table. Lisa snatched it up quickly, but she had no idea who she was dealing with. Why was Marcus being singled out? And how will he respond? Have you ever experienced unfair treatment like Marcus? Let us know in the comments. Where are you watching from? Drop your city below. Marcus watched Lisa walk away with his credit card, smugly tapping it against her palm. He remained calm, but inside he was taking in every single detail. The way she barely looked at him, the way she spoke to him like he was beneath her, the way she lied about a policy that didn't exist. He glanced to his right. A well-dressed white couple at the next table had just ordered their meals without paying a cent up front. The waiter even told them, "Take your time, no rush." Marcus turned back just as Lisa returned, dropping the receipt onto the table. "There, paid in full. Now, what do you want?" she asked, arms crossed. Marcus stayed composed. "Tell me something, Lisa. Does everyone have to pay before they order?" Lisa stiffened. "It's just sometimes, depending on the situation." The white couple nearby overheard the exchange. The woman, clearly uncomfortable, spoke up. "That's not true. We didn't have to pay up front." Lisa's face flushed. She glared at the woman before turning back to Marcus. "It's just a precaution. You never know who might walk out without paying." Marcus let out a slow breath, nodding. "I see." Just then, a man in a suit walked over. Greg, the restaurant manager. "Is there a problem here?" Greg asked, eyeing Marcus as if he were the one causing trouble. Lisa spoke up before Marcus could. "He's refusing to follow store policy." Greg barely concealed his disdain as he looked Marcus up and down. "Sir, if you can't afford to eat here, maybe this isn't the right place for you." Silence fell over the restaurant. A few customers looked over, sensing something was wrong. Marcus stared at both of them, his patience thinning. He had built this restaurant to be a place of excellence, not a place where people like him were disrespected, but he wasn't done yet. He was going to let this play out. With a small nod, Marcus picked up the menu, pretending to think over his order. "Fine, I'll have the filet mignon," he said. Lisa snatched the menu back without another word. As she walked away, Marcus rested his elbows on the table, watching them closely. They had no idea who they had just humiliated. What will Marcus do next? Marcus ate his meal in silence, watching everything unfold. Every now and then, he glanced around the restaurant, observing how the staff interacted with other customers. It was clear. The white customers were greeted with warm smiles and casual conversation. They weren't rushed. They weren't asked to pay up front. Meanwhile, Lisa and Greg kept throwing glances in his direction, whispering behind the counter. They were still judging him, but Marcus remained calm. He was waiting, watching, taking notes. When he finished his meal, he motioned for Lisa to come over. She strolled up, smirking. "So, what now?" Marcus wiped his mouth with a napkin and placed it neatly on the table. "I'd like to speak to the owner," he said, his tone calm but firm. Lisa chuckled, shaking her head. "The owner?" She crossed her arms. "Yeah, that's not happening." Marcus tilted his head. "Why not?" Lisa rolled her eyes. "Because the owner doesn't have time for people like you." Marcus let those words hang in the air. He could hear the sheer arrogance in her voice, the way she dismissed him like he was nothing. He smiled slightly. "You sure about that?" Lisa laughed. "Trust me, buddy. The owner of this place would never waste his time talking to you." Marcus pulled out his phone, pressed a button, and spoke into the receiver. "Tell the general manager to come in. Now." Lisa's smirk faded. "Excuse me?" she asked, her voice suddenly unsure. A few minutes later, the restaurant's general manager walked in, looking around before locking eyes with Marcus. To Lisa's horror, the manager's face lit up with recognition. "Mr. James, I wasn't expecting you tonight, sir." The entire restaurant fell silent. Lisa froze. Greg, who had been watching from behind the counter, went pale. Marcus calmly placed his phone on the table and leaned forward. "So, Lisa, Greg, you were saying?" How will Lisa and Greg react now? Lisa stood frozen, her smirk long gone. Greg's face turned ghostly pale. The general manager, Mr. Thompson, walked straight to Marcus, extending a respectful handshake. "Mr. James, I'm so sorry about this. I had no idea you were coming in tonight." Marcus took his time, shaking Thompson's hand firmly, but his eyes never left Lisa and Greg. Lisa stammered, "Wait, you're Mr. James?" Greg swallowed hard, sweat forming on his forehead. "You own the restaurant?" Marcus leaned back in his chair, folding his arms. "That's right. I built this place. And tonight, I got to see exactly how my customers are treated when I'm not around." Lisa's hands shook slightly. I was just following policy," she blurted. Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Oh? Show me in my policy where it says black customers must pay up front." Lisa opened her mouth, but no words came out. Greg, realizing there was no way out, jumped in. "Mr. James, listen. This is just a misunderstanding. We were just trying to protect the business." Marcus's jaw tightened. Protect the business? From what? A paying customer? Greg gulped. "It's not like that." Marcus stood up slowly, adjusting his suit jacket. "I see. So, you thought I didn't belong here. You assumed I couldn't afford my own meal, didn't you?" Lisa and Greg exchanged nervous glances. The tension in the restaurant was suffocating. Customers watched in shock, waiting to see what would happen next. Marcus took a deep breath, glancing around at his employees. Some looked ashamed. Others looked relieved, as if they had been waiting for this moment. Then he turned back to Lisa and Greg. His voice was calm, but his words were final. "You're both fired." Gasps rippled through the restaurant. Lisa staggered back. "What? No, wait, Greg pleaded. Sir, please, let's talk about this. Marcus shook his head. There's nothing to talk about. I refuse to let my business be a place where customers are judged by the color of their skin. Will Lisa and Greg accept their fate? Or will they try to fight back? Lisa stood frozen, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. Her usual confidence had vanished. She had nothing to say. Mr. James, please, Greg started, his voice shaky. Marcus raised a hand, cutting him off. His gaze was sharp, unwavering. Lisa, you said you were just following restaurant policy. So tell me. He pulled out his phone and tapped the screen. Show me where in my policy it says that black customers must pay up front. Lisa's face turned red. I was just trying to be careful. Marcus tilted his head. Careful? Or prejudiced? Lisa's eyes darted around the room, but no one came to her defense. Greg, now desperate, jumped in. Sir, this is a misunderstanding. We were just trying to protect the business. Marcus chuckled, but there was no humor in it. Protect the business? He folded his arms. So, you thought a black man couldn't afford a meal here? Greg swallowed hard. He had no way out. Lisa and Greg looked at each other, their faces pale. The entire restaurant was silent. Staff members, customers, everyone was watching, waiting to see what would happen next. Marcus sighed, shaking his head. I built this restaurant to be a place where everyone is treated with respect. And tonight, I saw firsthand how that respect is only given to certain people. Lisa pleaded, I didn't mean any harm. I was just doing what I thought was best. Marcus locked eyes with her. You humiliated a paying customer. You singled me out. You lied about a policy that doesn't exist. And worst of all, he took a deep breath. You did it so easily, like it was normal. Lisa's shoulders sank. She knew she had no excuse. Marcus turned to Greg. And you? He shook his head. Instead of correcting the problem, you backed her up. Greg's chest rose and fell, panic flashing across his face. Marcus exhaled, then turned to the entire staff. This kind of discrimination has no place in my restaurant. Ever. Then he looked back at Lisa and Greg. You're both fired. Gasps rippled through the restaurant. Lisa staggered back. What? No, wait. Greg tried to protest. Sir, please. Marcus held up a hand. This conversation is over. Will Lisa and Greg accept their fate? Or will they try to fight back? Marcus took a deep breath and slowly stood. The entire restaurant watched in stunned silence. Every customer, every employee, all eyes were on him. Lisa and Greg stood frozen, their faces pale, their confidence completely shattered. Marcus looked around the room, then turned his gaze back to them. Racism has no place in my business, he said firmly, and neither do people like you. Lisa gasped, her eyes widening in panic. Please, Mr. James, I didn't mean... But Marcus held up a hand. You humiliated me. You humiliated my customers. And worst of all, you did it like it was normal. Lisa opened her mouth, but no words came out. Marcus took a deep breath. Lisa, you're fired. Effective immediately. The restaurant erupted into whispers. Some employees nodded in agreement while others just looked shocked. Lisa staggered back. What? No, you can't. I just did. She turned to Greg, desperate. But he was too busy panicking about his own fate. Greg stepped forward, his hands shaking. Sir, please. I've worked here for years. I made a mistake. Don't throw my career away over this. Marcus tilted his head, studying him. You let this happen under your watch, he said slowly. Instead of correcting the problem, you made excuses. You backed her up. You made me feel like I didn't belong in my own business. Greg's eyes filled with fear. Please, Mr. James, I can change. Marcus paused. He considered it, just for a moment. Then he exhaled and shook his head. "You're done, too." The entire restaurant gasped. A few employees even nodded in approval. Greg stumbled back, his face red with humiliation. Lisa looked like she was about to cry. Marcus stared them down one last time. "Get out." Lisa and Greg had no choice. They turned and walked toward the exit, their heads hanging low. As the door swung shut behind them, the tension in the restaurant finally eased. But Marcus knew this was only the beginning. How will the restaurant recover from this scandal? With Lisa and Greg gone, the restaurant felt different, lighter, as if a weight had been lifted. But Marcus knew this wasn't over. He couldn't just fire 2 people and expect everything to change. So, that same night, he gathered his remaining staff for an emergency meeting. The employees sat quietly, some still shaken from what had just happened. Others looked relieved, as if they had been waiting for change. Marcus stood at the front, his voice calm but firm. "Let me be clear. This restaurant is built on respect. Every customer, no matter their background, should feel welcome here." The staff nodded, listening carefully. Then, suddenly, one of the waitresses, Sarah, stepped forward. She hesitated for a moment before speaking. "Mr. James, I need to say something." Marcus motioned for her to continue. Sarah took a deep breath. "I knew what Lisa was doing was wrong. I saw it happen, and I didn't speak up." The room fell silent. Sarah's eyes welled with regret. "I was afraid. I didn't want to cause trouble. But after tonight, I won't make that mistake again." Marcus studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Owning up to your mistakes is the first step toward change. I appreciate your honesty, Sarah." She let out a shaky breath, looking relieved. Marcus turned back to the rest of the staff. "Starting next week, we'll be launching a diversity and inclusion training program, and I expect every single one of you to attend." A few employees exchanged glances. One of the cooks, a young man named Daniel, raised his hand. "Will you be leading it?" Marcus shook his head. "We're bringing in professionals. This isn't just about my experience. It's about making sure this never happens again." The employees nodded in agreement. For the first time that night, Marcus felt hopeful. This wasn't just about firing 2 bad employees. This was about rebuilding the restaurant's values from the ground up. Will the restaurant's reputation survive after this? By the next morning, news about what happened in the restaurant had spread like wildfire. Social media exploded. Some people applauded Marcus's decision, calling it a bold stand against discrimination. Others criticized him, saying firing Lisa and Greg was too extreme. Comments flooded in. Finally, someone holding people accountable. This is why cancel culture is out of control. Respect should be the standard, not a debate. Reporters picked up the story. News stations ran segments about it. And then, the phone rang. Marcus picked up, and a familiar voice came through. "Mr. James, this is Rachel Morgan from Channel 7 News. We'd love to interview you about what happened." Marcus exhaled, already expecting this. Later that day, he stood outside his restaurant, facing a camera crew. Rachel, the reporter, held a microphone to him. "Mr. James, some say your decision was justified. Others say firing Lisa and Greg was too harsh. Do you regret what you did?" Marcus didn't hesitate. "I regret that it had to happen at all." Rachel raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" Marcus met her gaze. "I regret that discrimination is still happening in places where everyone should feel welcome. I regret that I had to fire 2 people, instead of them choosing to do the right thing. But do I regret holding them accountable? The camera crew fell silent for a moment. Then Rachel nodded, lowering her mic. "Thank you for your time, Mr. James." Later that evening, Marcus sat in his office, wondering how the restaurant would recover. But then, the first customer of the night walked in, then another and another. People weren't just coming back. They were showing support. A woman walked up to Marcus and shook his hand. "I brought my family here tonight because I respect what you did," she said. Marcus felt a wave of relief. Maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something bigger. Will Marcus's actions inspire real change? A week after the incident, Marcus found himself sitting under the bright lights of a live TV studio. Across from him, the well-known host, David Collins, adjusted his earpiece, preparing for the interview. Millions of viewers were watching, waiting to hear from the man who had taken a bold stand against discrimination. David leaned forward. "Mr. James, your decision to fire 2 employees over racial discrimination has sparked a nationwide conversation. Some people say you overreacted, while others call you a hero. Why did you take such a strong stand?" Marcus took a deep breath and looked directly at David. "Because I know what it feels like to be judged before you even speak." David nodded, intrigued. "What do you mean by that?" Marcus clasped his hands together. "My whole life, I've walked into places where people made assumptions about me before I said a single word. They judged me by my skin color, not my character. And for years I let it slide. But this time I had the power to do something about it. And I wasn't going to stay silent." The room was silent for a moment. Even the camera crew seemed to pause. Then David asked the question everyone wanted to hear. "What do you want people to learn from this?" Marcus didn't hesitate. He looked straight into the camera and spoke with conviction. "We have to do better. We have to treat each other with respect. And if you see injustice, don't ignore it. Speak up." David leaned back, letting those words settle. The broadcast cut to commercial, but the message had already spread. Later that evening, Marcus sat in his office, scrolling through his phone. Messages flooded his inbox, from business owners, customers, even strangers who were inspired by his stand. Some restaurants announced new diversity training programs. Other business owners reached out, saying they were reevaluating their policies. Maybe, just maybe, change was starting. Will businesses finally change how they treat people? Marcus pushed open the doors to his restaurant, stepping inside for the first time since his TV interview. The familiar scent of fresh coffee and sizzling food filled the air. But something was different. For the first time in weeks, the tension was gone. As he walked in, his employees greeted him with smiles. Some nodded in respect, others gave him a thumbs up. They had been through a storm, but they had come out stronger. Just as Marcus was about to head to his office, the door chimed again. A young black man, maybe in his early 20s, stepped inside. He looked nervous as he approached the counter, clutching his phone in his hand. Marcus noticed him immediately. "Can I help you, son?" The young man hesitated, then spoke softly. "Sir, I saw what you did on the news. I just wanted to say thank you." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "For what?" The young man swallowed hard. "For standing up, for people like me. I've been treated like that before, but I never had the courage to speak up. Seeing you do it." He exhaled, his voice shaky. It meant something. Marcus felt a lump in his throat. He hadn't expected this. He had fought for what was right, but now he realized he had inspired something bigger. He extended his hand. "Thank you for saying that." The young man smiled and shook it firmly. Marcus turned to his staff, his voice steady and full of conviction. "This is how we do business, from now on and always." His employees nodded in agreement. They understood. This wasn't just about one incident. This was about creating a new standard. Marcus looked around the restaurant, seeing familiar faces, customers who had come back because they believed in what he stood for. He took a deep breath and said the words that would define everything from that moment on. "Change starts with us." The restaurant erupted into quiet applause, not out of obligation but out of respect. Marcus smiled, knowing this was just the beginning.